Hello everyone, welcome to my presentation on Judith Butler's essay, Torture and the Ethics of Photography, Thinking with Sontag. I hope you're all doing well and looking after yourself. Judith Butler is an American philosopher from Cleveland, Ohio, whose work has influenced many areas of study, but most particularly the fields of feminist and queer theory, as well as cultural studies and literary theory. One of her most notable ideas is that gender and even sex is a social construct that we perform, questioning the strongly held beliefs, at the time of her first publication in 1988, that certain gendered behaviors are natural and essential to masculinity and femininity, pointing out that these are rather a performative repetition of acts that have been transmitted through historical social practice. The essay I will look at today is the second of 5 essays compiled in Judith Butler's book, Frames of War, When Is Life Grievable? This book was edited and refined in between 2004 and 2008, a context and time that sees George W. Bush in office and the Abu Ghraib incident, which I will explain on the following slides, occur. The main questions that Butler looks at in this book, as suggested by the subtitle, is what lives come to be seen as grievable. In other words, what lives seem worthy of our grief, and which others do not. This is entwined with the concern Butler has with the way that the state and media frame war, or more importantly, how they fail to frame war. She says that to call the frame into question is to show that it never quite contained the scene it was meant to limn. In other words, to question the media or state's portrayal of war, death, and atrocity is to suggest that this portrayal is a failure to begin with. Butler is interested not simply in what is shown, but how it is shown. Torture and the Ethics of Photography, Thinking with Sontag, is written in dialogue to Sontag's on photography and regarding the suffering of others. Sontag's view was that narrative devices produce an understanding, like captions and slogans and articles, whereas images can only haunt us, stifling any sort of political response. This is because she believes war photography aestheticizes suffering, normalizing suffering, and desensitizing us to it. Sontag sees, in Butler's words, a split between affect and cognition. That affect stifles and forestalls cognition because it lives only in the momentary, like it is a flash of feeling that goes. However, Butler argues that it is the effect on us by images that help us understand, or motivates us to take up a course of action in response to them. It's perhaps important also to introduce you to the concept of embedded reporting, the origins of which began with the Falklands Law, where during the war only 2 photographers were permitted to document the war, no TV crew were allowed. The Falklands War was between Britain and Argentina, Britain claiming that the Falklands Islands belonged to them. Many thought Margaret Thatcher would not be bothered to go to war for them, but she did, helping to give her this title and identity of the Iron Lady. Embedded reporting is the restrictions by state on what can and cannot be reported or captured. The reporters agree not to mandate perspective itself, but their gaze remains restricted to the parameters enforced by the state. As an example, looking at the Falklands, the British wanted to be seen globally as victorious, and hid or downplayed British casualties, like the destruction of Royal Navy boat HMS Sheffield, so it did not galvanise political opposition to the war at home. Or we could suggest having any images that might show Argentinian lives as grievable. This sort of embedded reporting, or interest in being represented as victorious, paved way to images like Margaret Thatcher in a tank. The historical context of the essay is also important as it refers and analyzes historical events such as the Abu Ghraib incident, set against the backdrop of the Iraq War. Abu Ghraib was a prison in Iraq in which American soldiers violated and tortured Iraqi detainees, and captured this torture by camera. The photos were released to CBS News in April 2004, coming to public attention. The images show brutality, humiliation, rape, murder. I will not use the images in this presentation because of their nature. Butler applies the question of grievability and questions of what it is to be human to this case, which I will explore later in the presentation. Here are some front pages from the time to show how the media and state portrayed the war. So the first key fragment I have chosen is this one. The very action of the war, its practices and its effects are meant to be established by the perspective that the Department of Defense orchestrates and permits, thereby illustrating the orchestrative power of the state to ratify what will be called reality, the extent of what is perceived to exist. I find this fragment important as it comes after a previous point made by Butler that how we respond to the suffering of others, how we formulate moral criticism, articulate political analyses, depends on a perceptible reality already established, which makes us consider that the reality of war is not reality, but a construction, a perspective of the state, thus implying that our response to suffering and moral criticism is kind of controlled by the state too. My second key fragment answers the questions of what makes one human in the state's idea, and explains how the Abu Ghraib tortures were justified or celebrated in the name of American triumphalism. There are norms, explicit or tacit, governing which human lives count as human and as living, and which do not. I feel that this helps answers Butler's questions about which lives we see as grievable. Butler argues that the torture of the prisoners in Abu Ghraib was uniquely designed to exploit cultural sensitivities of Muslims like homosexuality and modesty, and torturing the prisoners in these ways presented them as part of a regressive, backwards culture, as preying on these sensitivities was most effective for their suffering, and therefore elevating supposed American progressiveness. Viewers at the time believed that they were uniquely suited to suffer in these ways. In the next essay of the book, Sexual Politics, Torture and Time, she expands on this by saying that the torture was a way to coercively produce the Arab subject and the Arab mind. The frame helps paint these lives as non-grievable because it shows them as not human, not fitting to the norms of the West, different, uncivilized, immoral, and unworthy. The people who took the first photograph fit the perspective of war, crafting, commending, and validating this point of view. On page 93, Butler says that the prisoners are not conceptualized by the civilizational and racial norms by which the human is constituted. And she also says that the very act of torture not only presupposes that the detainees are inhuman, but is reinstituted by being tortured. The final key fragment I chose is this one. It is not only or exclusively an effective register that the photograph operates, but through instituting a certain mode of acknowledgement, it argues for the grievability of a life. Its pathos is at once effective and interpretive. If we can be haunted, then we can acknowledge that there has been a loss and hence there has been a life, also a potential judgment. And it requires that we conceive of grievability as the precondition of life. Not only do I feel this bridges the gap in Sontag's notions of effect and cognition, but also shows that photography as a device, and in this case war photography, acts as a sort of reminder that there is life and humanity in the subjects of its photos, through the effects we feel, as if it keeps them alive, or reminds us of their pastness of life. Photos themselves have agency, and different frames can be used, or that we can see through the frame, approach frames critically. So the first fragment I chose that I thought we could have a discussion about or it'd be interesting to think about is this one. Recent war photography departs significantly from the conventions of war photo journalism that were at work 30 or 40 years ago, where the photographer or camera person would attempt to enter the action through angles and modes of access that sought to expose the war in ways that no government had planned. Now the state works on the field of representability in order to control effects. I thought it would be interesting to think about embedded reporting today because this book was written in the 2000s. Is the press and media free now compared to during the times of Bush, for example? yeah, I just thought it'd be interesting to talk about. The second fragment I thought we could maybe think about, or there's some stuff in that might need clarifying, is this one. And then there are frames that foreclose responsiveness, where this activity of foreclosure is effectively and repeatedly performed by the frame itself, its own negative action, as it were, towards what will not be explicitly represented. I thought if maybe anyone could think of an example of a frame that might foreclose responsiveness and how it would do this, I think it'd be interesting to speak about that. And finally, this is the last discussion fragment I chose from the text. Let the atrocious images haunt us. Her imperative suggests that there are conditions in which we can refuse to be haunted, or where haunting cannot reach us. I was thinking about what are these conditions? How might one refuse to be haunted by an image? And why might one want to not be haunted by an image? Butler's essay is very effective in showing how war, death, atrocity is framed by the state and media to prevent us from recognizing the victims of war as grievable lives, and Butler looks at how these frames become our perceptive reality. Understanding this will lead to the dismantling of these structuring forces that have framed and still frame war by exposing them, bringing them into view. Thank you for listening.